The morning they found Thaddeus Kestrel's cattle standing calm and dry on top of a stone wall, wading out 3 feet of floodwater like it was nothing more than a puddle after a spring shower. Half the county finally stopped laughing. But let's back up, because to understand why that single moment shook an entire farming community to its core, you need to know how one quiet, stubborn old man became the biggest joke in Colby County, Nebraska, and how the very thing everyone mocked him for ended up saving lives, homes, and 100 years of topsoil downstream. Thaddeus Kestrel was 71 years old, built like a fence post, and about as talkative as one too. He'd inherited 320 acres from his father, who'd inherited it from a Kestrel before him, all the way back to a homesteader who'd walked out onto the rolling hill country west of the Missouri River bluffs in 1887, and decided this land, with its steep draws and long grassy slopes, was worth staying for. For most of his life, Thaddeus farmed the way everyone else in Colby County did. Corn on the flatter bottomland, soybeans on the gentler rises, rotate, plant, harvest, repeat. He wasn't a rich man, but he wasn't hurting either. Then, about 15 years ago, something in him changed. It started small. He began stacking the fieldstones he cleared every spring, not hauling them off to a pile at the edge of the property like every farmer does, but arranging them along the contour lines of his highest slopes, across the steep draws where rainwater cut deep gullies through his topsoil every April, around the low terraces of his southern pasture, the one that rolled gently down toward Willow Creek before the creek wound on toward Harmon Voss's land, and eventually the edge of town itself. His neighbors noticed. Of course they noticed. In a place where everyone's business travels faster than the wind off the bluffs, a grown man spending his weekends building waist-high stone walls that ran sideways across his hills instead of straight fence lines was the kind of thing people talked about over coffee at the Colby diner. Old Kestrel's building himself a maze up there on that hillside, joked Delphine Ashgrove, who ran the feed store on Main Street. Or maybe he's expecting an invasion. Harmon Voss, who farmed the section just downhill and downstream from Thaddeus, wasn't so gentle about it. Harmon had modernized everything on his own land: GPS-guided tractors, tile drainage that whisked water off his fields fast, the works. He genuinely believed Thaddeus was wasting good farmland on a hobby. "You could plant 6 more rows of beans if you tore those things out," Harmon told him once, standing at the fence line with his arms crossed. "You're losing money every season those walls sit there doing nothing but collecting rocks." Thaddeus just nodded slowly, the way he did with most things, and said, "They're not doing nothing." He never explained further. That was the thing about Thaddeus, he wasn't the type to defend himself with words. He let his hands do the talking, stone by stone, year after year, until the walls stretched nearly 2 miles across the slopes of his land, tracing the natural curves of the hills like something out of an old European hill country instead of a typical American cattle spread. People started calling it Kestrel's Folly. Kids on the school bus pointed at it. Even his own grandson, 12-year-old Anson, once asked him outright, "Grandpa, why do you waste so much time on walls that don't keep anything in or out?" Thaddeus set down his hammer, wiped his forehead, and gave the boy the same answer he gave everyone. "Water doesn't like being told where to go, but it'll listen if you ask it right." Anson didn't understand, not yet. What almost nobody in Colby County knew, because Thaddeus rarely spoke of it, was that he hadn't come up with this idea on his own. Decades earlier, as a young man, he'd spent 2 years working a rebuilding project in rural Vermont after catastrophic flooding tore through the valley towns there. He'd watched engineers and old-timers alike study the hillsides, watched how certain slopes eroded into ruin while others, protected by old stone terracing left behind by farmers a century before, held firm through storm after storm. He'd never forgotten it. The stone walls weren't decoration. They were contour barriers, a centuries-old land management technique where low walls are built along the natural elevation lines of a slope, not running straight up and down it. When heavy rain falls on a hillside, water doesn't just charge downhill unimpeded, carving gullies and stripping away topsoil as it goes. Instead, it hits the wall, slows down, spreads out along the barrier, and has time to sink into the ground instead of racing off with the soil. It's the same basic principle behind the terrace farming you'd see carved into hillsides in the Philippines or Peru, except Thaddeus had adapted it, quietly and patiently, to the rolling bluff country of eastern Nebraska. Where other farmers saw wasted acreage, Thaddeus saw insurance. Slow the water down at the top of the watershed, and you save not just your own land, but everything downhill from it. Speed it up instead, and eventually it takes everything in its path. He never got the chance to explain this properly to his neighbors. Pride, maybe. Or the simple fact that in farming communities, results talk louder than theories. And for 15 years, there'd been no reason for anyone to test his theory at all. Until the spring, everything changed. That April, the rain didn't stop. It started as a normal spring system, the kind every Nebraska farmer had seen 100 times. But then, a second storm stacked on top of the first, and a third stacked on top of that. 7 inches fell across the county in 18 hours. The National Weather Service issued a flash flood warning for the entire watershed. Willow Creek, which normally ambled along at a few feet wide beneath Thaddeus's hillside, swelled into something unrecognizable, and it carried that swelling straight downhill toward Harmon's land and the town beyond. Thaddeus felt it first. In a way, his terrace slopes were the highest ground the storm hit before the water reached anyone else. But because his walls slowed the runoff, spread it thin, and let it soak in rather than sending it downhill all at once, his own fields never saw the worst of it. His cattle, which he'd moved to the highest terrace at the first sign of trouble, stood calm and dry while the lower pasture filled and drained like a well-designed drainage basin, because that's exactly what it was. Harmon Voss wasn't so lucky. His fields, flat-tiled and drained for maximum efficiency, turned the floodwater that did make it past Thaddeus's slopes into a racing sheet that ripped straight through his lower 40 acres. Topsoil that had taken generations to build vanished in a single night. Carried downstream in muddy brown torrents. Further down the same creek, a young couple named Odessa and Corwin Pratt, who'd just taken out a loan to buy their first parcel of land at the edge of town, watched in horror as the rising water undercut the foundation of their brand-new equipment barn. Panic spread through the county overnight. Livestock had to be moved. Roads washed out. The volunteer fire department, led by a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Marguerite Oduya, was stretched thin trying to reach stranded families along the Lower Creek Road. And then someone nobody quite remembers who mentioned that Thaddeus Kestrel's land, sitting right at the top of the whole watershed, hadn't flooded nearly as badly as everyone expected. When the first trucks made it up the hill to check on him, what they found stopped them cold. Kestrel's fields, the ones laced with those useless stone walls, were largely intact. The water that came pouring down from the highest ground on his property hit his contour walls one terrace at a time, and did exactly what Thaddeus had spent 15 years designing them to do. It slowed, it spread, it sank in. Instead of one violent surge tearing down the hillside all at once, the water moved gently, almost politely, pooling in shallow, controlled sheets that soaked into the soil instead of stripping it away, and sending it crashing downhill toward Harmon and the Pratts. It wasn't a miracle. It was hydrology. Patient, unglamorous, 15 years in the making hydrology, and engineers who later studied the flood pattern estimated that Thaddeus's network of stone terraces had absorbed and delayed a significant volume of the runoff that would otherwise have hit Harmon's fields and the Pratts' new barn all at once, instead of in the slower, more manageable pulse that actually reached them. It hadn't stopped the flood entirely. Harmon still lost soil. The Pratts still lost a barn foundation. But Marguerite Oduya, standing in the wreckage along the creek road, said it plainly to anyone who'd listen. Without whatever had slowed that water up on the Kestrel place, the surge reaching town would have come in one single, catastrophic wave instead of the staggered flooding they'd actually dealt with. The difference, she said, was very likely the difference between a hard week of cleanup and a disaster with bodies attached to it. The morning after the worst of the flooding, Marguerite stood at the edge of Thaddeus's lower pasture with her boots sinking into wet but stable ground, staring at cattle contentedly grazing on a stone terrace, while muddy water still churned in the ditches along the county road below. "Thaddeus," she said, shaking her head, "you might have just saved this whole end of the county." He shrugged the way he always did. "Wasn't trying to save anybody, just didn't want to lose my dirt." Harmon Voss showed up later that day, unannounced, standing at the fence line where he'd once mocked the very walls now credited with slowing the flood before it ever reached his ruined fields. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. He just stood there for a long while, looking at the calm, terraced hillside next to his own gullied, washed-out land, and finally said, "Teach me how you did it." Thaddeus nodded slowly. "Gonna take more than an afternoon." "I've got time," Harmon said. And that, more than anything, was the moment the whole county's opinion of Thaddeus Kestrel flipped. Not because he'd set out to prove a point, but because he never tried to prove one in the first place. He'd simply done the quiet, patient work of understanding his own hillside and let the results speak when the moment finally came. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Extension agents from the University of Nebraska drove out to study Thaddeus's terraces and measure the runoff difference for themselves. Local news ran a segment on the walls that held back the flood. Farmers from 3 counties over came just to see the stone lines they'd heard so much about, the same walls that, a month earlier, would have been the punchline of a joke at the Colby diner. Even Delphine Ashgrove drove out one Sunday afternoon, boots sinking into the same soft ground Marguerite had stood on weeks before. She found Thaddeus repairing a section the flood had loosened. "Guess it wasn't a maze after all," she said. "Told you they weren't doing nothing," Thaddeus said, and for once there was the faintest trace of a smile under all that dust. Young Anson, the grandson who'd once asked why his grandfather wasted his time, spent that whole summer working alongside him, learning how to read a slope, how to set a stone so it wouldn't shift under pressure, how to let water teach you where it wanted to go so you could gently, patiently convince it otherwise. "You were right, Grandpa," Anson said one evening, sweaty and sunburned, sitting on top of a wall they just finished repairing. "Water does listen if you ask it right." Thaddeus allowed himself a rare, full smile this time. "Takes most folks a flood to learn that. Glad you didn't need one." Today, Thaddeus Kestrel's stone walls are still standing thicker now, extended further, copied by neighbors who once rolled their eyes at every one of them. The hillsides around Colby County look a little different these days. A little more like they're working with the water instead of fighting it, terrace by terrace. The way land has been managed for centuries in places wiser about their hills than the modern plains ever learned to be. And every spring, when the rains come hard and fast the way they sometimes do out on the bluffs, the old-timers watch those quiet stone lines across Thaddeus Kestrel's land and think of a man who spent 15 patient years building something nobody understood until the one day everybody needed it. If this story moved you or taught you something about the quiet wisdom of old-fashioned farming, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we bring you a brand new story like this every single week, celebrating the land, the people, and the timeless lessons of American farm life. Don't miss the next one.